The lights inside the Fairmont Chateau Laurier had been burning for 3 hours when the music stopped. Not slowly, not politely. One moment the string quartet was halfway through something Vivaldi, and the next 400 guests in the grand ballroom turned in unison toward the entrance. Because a woman had appeared at the top of the marble stairs, and she had not come to celebrate. Bridget Okafor stood in the doorway, wearing the same shade of deep blue that had hung in the national press for 8 months. The color of the keynote banner. The night she launched the Holloway collection to a standing ovation at the Vancouver Convention Center. She had designed that collection alone, sewn the prototypes by hand in a studio her husband claimed was too small for the size of her ambition, and watched the reviews come in calling it the most significant debut in Canadian fashion in a decade. Her husband was already at the bottom of the stairs. He stood with his hand on the small of another woman's back, and he did not see Bridget until the room went quiet and told him to look up. His face went the color of old milk. The woman beside him, young and comfortable in a red dress that was designed to be noticed, had her champagne glass halfway to her mouth when she followed his gaze and understood. Bridget descended the stairs without rushing. She had nothing left to prove in this particular moment and everything to reclaim in every moment after it. She moved through the crowd like a woman who had already survived the worst of it and come out carrying the evidence. She had not come to beg. She had not come to cry. She had come because the Chandler Foundation Gala was held in a building her father helped fund, in a city she'd dressed for 20 years, and because Rowan Chandler had spent 4 months making her feel like a ghost in her own career. She was done being a ghost. The morning Bridget's marriage broke open. She was finishing the sketches for a bridal capsule, commissioned by a boutique hotel group in Montreal. Her studio was in their house in the Glebe, Ottawa, not the Glebe they sold to move west, but the one she'd insisted on keeping as a workspace when they relocated back east for Rowan's consulting contract. Floor-to-ceiling windows, afternoon light, bolts of silk crepe stacked against the east wall. She had been awake since 5. Her phone buzzed on the drafting table. Rowan, late night. Don't wait up. She didn't. She hadn't in months. What she did was reach for the mailing tube that had arrived the day before, addressed in handwriting she didn't recognize, no return address. Inside was a rolled document and a small note on plain card stock. Someone thinks you should know. That's all it said. The document was printed, clean, 12 pages of emails and calendar exports and 1 photograph. The emails were between Rowan and a woman named Delphine Laurier. They spanned 14 months. The calendar exports showed evenings marked client, when Bridget had been at her studio sewing until 2 in the morning, trying to make the Vancouver deadline. The photograph showed Rowan and Delphine at a restaurant Bridget knew, La Fougère in Chelsea, Quebec, where Rowan had told her he'd been having dinner with a procurement director from the government contract. They were not discussing procurement. Bridget set the photograph down carefully. The way you set down something fragile even though it was just paper and it had already done all its damage. She pulled up the studio's shared calendar and began to cross-reference. Every marked evening, every late return, every migraine, every cancelled plan, every night she'd been so deep in pattern work that she hadn't noticed his side of the bed was cold until morning. 14 months. She had submitted the Holloway collection for review 11 months ago. She had been working 18-hour days. She had believed they were building something. The front door opened at 12:30. Rowan set his keys on the counter, poured water, moved through the kitchen like a man who lived there without thinking about it. He walked into the studio. "You're still up," he said. "Who is she?" Bridget didn't look up from the table. Silence then. "What?" She turned the photograph toward him. He went very still. She watched his expression run through 3 versions of a response before he settled on the one he'd probably rehearsed without knowing he was rehearsing it. Not denial, not anger, but something that looked unsettlingly close to relief. "How long?" she said. "Bridget, how long, Rowan?" He sat down on the stool across from her. He rubbed the back of his neck. "About 14 months. 14 months. The Holloway collection, Montreal. The sleepless spring when she'd finally broken into the national market. You've been planning to leave. I've been trying to figure out how. You've been planning to leave, and while you were planning, you let me file the partnership papers. You let me put your name on the Holloway brand as co-director." Something crossed his face. Not guilt. Calculation, slipping out before he could pull it back. "Rowan." Her voice was so calm she frightened herself. "You waited until the brand had value. That's not. You waited until the name meant something, until the collection had press, until we had enough assets to split." He didn't answer. "Who is Delphine Laurier?" "She's a stylist. She's been freelancing for the foundation circuit. We met at a gala, here." Bridget kept her voice level. "You met her here? In my city, at an event I dressed you for." Rowan stood up and reached for his jacket. "I'm going to stay somewhere else tonight. We can talk tomorrow when we're both. If you walk out of this room right now, the next conversation we have will be with lawyers. He paused. Then he kept moving. She listened to his footsteps down the hall, the click of the front door, the sound of his car starting in the drive. Then she sat down at her drafting table and looked at the Montreal bridal sketches for a long time. They were good. They were honest. Every seam was hers. She picked up her phone and called her lawyer. The dissolution should have been quiet. Bridget had always believed in quiet. She had conducted her entire career in workshops and studios and late-night fitting rooms where the work spoke and the person who made it mostly didn't need to. Rowan had other ideas. 3 weeks after he moved into a rental in Westboro, Ottawa, Life ran a profile. Rowan Chandler, the magazine called him, a man navigating the intersection of fashion, philanthropy and personal reinvention. The photograph showed him at a cafe on Elgin Street, composed and sun-warmed, looking like someone who had just set down a weight. The piece did not name Bridget directly, but it didn't need to. Everyone who mattered knew who his wife was. Everyone who read the subtext understood what he was doing. He was described as a creative collaborator who had shaped the Holloway brand's community identity, who had built the relationships that brought the collection to national attention, who had, in the words of one anonymous source, been the emotional and strategic anchor behind one of the most celebrated Canadian fashion debuts in recent memory. The Holloway brand. Bridget had chosen that name alone. Sitting at a table in her parents' house in Fredericton, the weekend her mother suggested she use something that didn't sound so personal. She had drawn the logo herself, based on a wrought iron gate she'd photographed on a trip to Lunenburg. The collection had been sketched, draped, fitted and revised entirely in her studio while Rowan attended foundation events and told people she was brilliant. He had not been wrong about that part. He'd just decided to make himself the reason for it. Her phone rang constantly for 2 days after the article. Friends sending careful messages, colleagues asking if she was going to respond, her sister calling from Halifax to say in the directest possible terms that Rowan's version of events was a fabrication and someone needed to say so publicly. Bridget's lawyer, a woman named Patricia Dumont who had handled fashion IP disputes for 15 years, called with less sentiment and more urgency. His team has filed for co-ownership of the Holloway trademark, Patricia said. They're arguing that his business development and client relations work constituted co-creation of the brand. Bridget set down her coffee. He cannot own my name. He can argue co-ownership of the brand entity. It's not your birth name, it's a trade name registered under the partnership. Legally, there's an argument. It's based on a gate I photographed in Nova Scotia. He was in Toronto that weekend. I know. Get me every original sketch with a date, every fabric purchase receipt, every email where you made creative decisions without his involvement. Build me a timeline that proves the brand's identity predates any meaningful contribution from him. She spent a week building it. The timeline was not difficult to build because the truth, it turned out, was very well documented. Bridget had always dated her sketchbooks. She had always photographed her prototypes. She had always kept receipts because fabric was expensive and she had started this without money. What she found, while building her defense, was something else. Rowan had been using the brand's operating account to cover personal expenses. Dinners at restaurants she'd never been to, a hotel in Quebec City during a weekend she'd spent in her studio, flowers twice that she had not received. None of it was illegal. He was a co-director, but the picture it painted was specific. Patricia sent a formal audit request. Rowan's lawyers objected, then complied. What came back was worse than she'd expected and exactly what she'd feared. He had begun redirecting income from speaking invitations and brand licensing agreements into a separate account 3 months before she found the photograph. He had already retained a firm specializing in creative partnership dissolutions. He had, in the language of the audit, been systematically preparing his exit while she was designing the collection that made the exit worth something. The day Bridget received the audit findings, she drove to the Rideau River and sat on a bench for an hour without her phone. She thought about the night she'd finished the Holloway keynote presentation, and Rowan had brought her tea at 2 in the morning, and told her it was the best work she'd ever done. She thought about how she'd believed him. She thought about how much of her life she'd organized around his belief in her. She had been easy to fool because she had trusted completely. That was the part that sat in her chest like a stone, not the affair, not the legal maneuvering, but the fact that she'd been genuinely loved, or thought she had, and it had turned out to be a position someone was occupying while he built a better offer elsewhere. She drove home and called Patricia. I want to fight, she said. Good, Patricia said, because I want you to meet someone. The woman's name was Constance Adeyemi. She ran a small firm in Toronto that handled exactly one kind of client. Women in creative industries whose professional identities had been partially or wholly absorbed by a partner's public persona during a marriage, and who were now trying to get them back. Bridget drove to Toronto on a Thursday. Constance's office was on the second floor of a Victorian row house on Palmerston Avenue, spare and intentional. Bookshelves full of what looked like case files and art monographs mixed together without irony. "Tell me what you want," Constance said before Bridget had finished sitting down. "I want people to know who made the Holloway collection." "Do you want him destroyed or do you want the truth told?" Bridget thought about it. "Is there a difference? Destruction is satisfying for 6 weeks and then it becomes your identity. Truth is slower and it lasts. Truth then." Constance opened a folder. "I've already done some preliminary work. Your timeline checks out. The design credits are unambiguous once you know where to look. The problem isn't evidence. The problem is narrative. Right now the public story is that Rowan Chandler was the engine behind a brilliant but somewhat difficult artist. He's spent a year building that story with surgical precision. I know. So we rebuild yours." Constance pulled up a spreadsheet. "There are 42 interview requests in your inbox that you haven't answered in the past 2 years. I want you to start answering them, not to talk about him, not to respond to his version of events, to remind the fashion community that you exist and that your work has a perspective and a voice that has nothing to do with him." That feels like a lot of talking. You have been disappearing into your work for your entire career, while he talked on your behalf. That stops now. Bridget accepted the plan because she had no better one, and because Constance said it with the calm certainty of someone who had watched this particular story end well enough times to know what changed the ending. Over the following month, Bridget gave an interview to Fashion Magazine about the Holloway collection's design philosophy. She spoke at a panel on sustainable textiles at Ryerson. She appeared on a podcast that interviewed Canadian women in craft-based industries and talked for 90 minutes about growing up, watching her grandmother cut patterns at a kitchen table in Fredericton, about how every collection she made started with a hand drawing and ended with a seam allowance, about the years she'd worked alone in studios in 3 provinces before she had a name anyone recognized. She mentioned Rowan exactly once and only to describe his role accurately. Business development, client relations, external communications, important work, skilled work, not design work. The response was not immediate, but it was steady. Designers who had worked adjacent to the Holloway collection began corroborating her timeline in their own interviews. Not because Bridget asked them to, but because the record was true and the record was suddenly visible. A fashion critic who'd attended the Vancouver keynote published a piece noting that every technical innovation in the collection corresponded to solutions Bridget had publicly discussed in a design lecture 3 years prior. A thread on a fashion industry forum traced every award-winning piece back to a specific sketch she'd posted to her studio account, each dated. Rowan's lawyers sent a cease and desist. Patricia responded with the audit findings. Things went quiet for a few weeks, then Constance called. "I found something about Delphine Laurier," she said. Bridget waited. Before Rowan, she was involved with a married photographer who sat on the board of the Sobey Art Award. Before him, a married conductor with the Toronto Symphony. In both cases, the marriages ended, the men's professional associations suffered, and Delphine walked away with a career connection she didn't have before. The photographer introduced her to a commercial agency. The conductor gave her a contract for a touring exhibition she co-styled. Bridget sat with this for a moment. "You're telling me Rowan isn't the first?" "I'm telling you she has a pattern. And Rowan has something she wants, the brand. She's already registered as a consultant on his new venture. I pulled the incorporation documents. She's positioned herself as creative director." Bridget thought about this. She thought about Rowan, who had spent 12 years being the visible half of a partnership where someone else did the invisible work, and who had now chosen to start over with a woman who appeared to do the same thing, in the same role, with the same positioning. She thought about how long it would take before that equation ran its course. "Does he know?" she asked. "He's made peace with it. People often choose the version of themselves that flatters them most." The Chandler Foundation Gala was 3 weeks away. Constance brought it up the same day she delivered the findings on Delphine. "He'll be there," she said, "with her. They're presenting together in the foundation's sponsor acknowledgements. It's the first public outing." "I know. You've been a Chandler Foundation donor since it started. You dressed their inaugural gala. You have more reason to be in that building than almost anyone. You want me to go. I want you to stop disappearing," Constance said. "You have spent your entire career making work beautiful and then standing behind it. Walk in front of it for once." Bridget thought about the Fairmont. She thought about the marble stairs and the string quartet and 400 people who had spent the past 4 months whispering about her marriage in the past tense. "I'll go," she said. She spent the night before the gala in her studio. Not working exactly, sitting with the work. running her hands over the samples she'd finished that week for the Montreal Commission, feeling the seam lines, the weight of the fabric, the places where she'd made decisions that were entirely and only hers. Her sister called from Halifax. "You don't have to walk into that room," her sister said. "I know, you've already proven everything." "This isn't about proving something to them," Bridget said. "It's about proving something to myself." She wore the deep blue, not because it was dramatic though it was, but because it was from the Holloway Collection's pilot run, the first sample she'd made in Ottawa before she'd taken the line to Vancouver. She knew every stitch of it. She'd worn it twice before in her life, both times alone in the studio, checking the fall of the hem under different lights. She had never worn it in public. She had been saving it without knowing she was saving it. Now she knew. The car dropped her at the Fairmont's front entrance at 9:15. Photographers were stationed along the walkway, the usual cluster for a gala of this size. She walked past them without stopping. One photographer recognized her and called her name, and she turned and let him take the photograph and kept moving. Inside, the grand ballroom was exactly as she remembered it. Chandeliers, long tables, the smell of white wine and wood smoke from the fireplace in the east corridor. She took a glass from a passing server and moved into the room. The first person she recognized was a textile buyer from Montreal who had placed the first commercial order for the Holloway line. He saw her from across the room and came straight to her, and told her the bridal capsule was generating more pre-orders than anything his clients had seen in 3 years. Then a costume designer who'd seen the Ryerson panel, and wanted to talk about collaboration. Then a journalist from the Globe who had been trying to reach her for 6 months and asked, simply and without preamble, if she was ready to tell her story. "I'm getting there," Bridget said. The quartet stopped mid-phrase. The room turned. Rowan was at the bottom of the staircase, and the woman with him was in a red dress designed for maximum visibility. And he hadn't seen Bridget yet because he was doing what he always did in rooms like this, working the arrival, letting people absorb him before he found the next person to charm. Then someone near Bridget shifted, and Rowan followed the movement, and found her eyes instead. His expression did the thing she'd watched it do 12 years ago when something didn't go according to the plan he hadn't admitted to having. A fractional stillness. A recalibration. Delphine noticed him notice something, and followed his gaze, and her face settled into an expression that was not guilt and not discomfort but something harder. Assessment. She was measuring the distance between herself and whatever was about to shift. Bridget did not cross the room. She did not need to. The foundation's director, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Drummond who had known Bridget's mother from their years at the Ottawa Art Council, touched her elbow from behind. "I'm glad you're here," she said. "I've been meaning to tell you. We're crediting you separately in this year's program. The 2018 gala, the dress you made for the ambassador's wife. We listed it as a foundation commission but we never gave you individual credit. That was an oversight and I'm correcting it tonight. You don't have to." "I do." Patricia Drummond smiled with the firmness of a woman who had made enough uncorrected oversights in her life to know the difference between protocol and obligation. "You've been doing excellent work for a long time. It should be on the record." When the program began and the director made her opening remarks, she mentioned Bridget Okafor by name, not as the woman at the center of a public divorce, as the designer who had dressed 3 iterations of the gala, contributed to the Foundation's arts initiative, and whose work had been worn on 3 continents. The applause in the room was the kind that said the room already knew, and had been waiting for permission to say so. Bridget stood and acknowledged it, and sat back down and breathed. Rowan found her after the program, during the open cocktail hour, when the room had diffused into smaller conversations, and it was possible to approach someone without making it a scene. He waited until she was momentarily between conversations. "Bridget, Rowan, you look well." His voice had the careful neutrality of someone performing composure. "I am well." She turned to face him fully. "I've been working. I saw the fashion magazine piece." He shifted his weight slightly. "I thought it was unnecessary." "Did you? We could have handled this privately. We didn't need the industry involved." "You involved the industry when you gave Ottawa Life a narrative about being the creative anchor of my brand." She said it without heat. "You were the one who chose public. I'm just telling my side of it." "Your side?" His jaw tightened. "I spent 11 years supporting your career. You spent 11 years benefiting from it. That's not the same thing." Delphine arrived at his elbow with the precision of someone who had been watching the conversation from across the room and decided it had run long enough. "Everything all right?" Bridget looked at her steadily. "I was just finishing, Bridget." Delphine's voice was pitched at warm, a careful social warmth that didn't reach her eyes. "I've always admired your work, I know you have." Bridget said it simply, without cruelty, which was worse. "Your pattern of admiration is quite well documented at this point. A beat of silence in which Delphine's composure ran a very quick internal calculation. I don't know what you mean, I think you do, and I think Rowan will eventually. She looked at Rowan for a moment, not with anger, with something closer to the feeling you have when you see a house you used to live in and realize the new owners have already repainted the trim. I hope you both get exactly what you've been building toward. She turned back to the room. The rest of the evening was good. The food was good. The textiles conversation with a sustainable materials designer from Edmonton went for 40 minutes and ended in a tentative collaboration. A buyer from a Vancouver boutique asked to see the capsule collection early. Bridget stayed until the Fairmont began dimming lights. She stepped out into a November Ottawa night, cold and clear, the canal lit in the distance. Her phone showed a message from Patricia Dumont. Rowan's team had contacted her. They were revising their position. New offer: 30% of brand assets, no ongoing royalties, no intellectual property transfer. She did not text back immediately. She stood on Wellington Street for a moment and looked at the chateau behind her. Her father had attended board meetings in that building for 20 years. She had walked those floors since she was a girl, watching the light change on the stone floors, learning the particular weight of old Canadian grandeur. She had dressed women in these rooms. She had helped hold in her quiet and technical way a very particular piece of this city's public life together. Rowan could have 30% of the entity. He could have the filing cabinet contents, the shared email account, the business receipts from the first 3 years. What he could not have was the knowledge of how to cut a bias seam on a curved hem without pulling. He could not have the 17 years of sketchbooks she kept in archive boxes in her studio. He could not have the moment she sat in her grandmother's kitchen, at 12 years old, watching a woman make something from nothing with her hands and decided that would be her life. He could not have the Holloway collection. He never had it. He'd just been standing in the same room when it happened. She walked to her car and sat for a moment before starting the engine. Constance had asked her once, early in their work together, whether she wanted revenge or truth. She had chosen truth, and truth had been sufficient, because truth was the only thing Rowan couldn't rewrite, no matter how many media profiles he gave, or how many lawyers he retained, or how many versions of their history he circulated at Foundation Galas. The truth was documented in sketchbooks and seam lines and receipts from fabric shops in 3 provinces. The truth was in every hand-drawn pattern, every late-night technical solution, every commission that had come in because someone had seen Bridget Okafor's name on a label and trusted it. You could not take a person's name if it was built on something they had actually done. She started the engine and drove home through the sleeping Ottawa streets. 6 months later, the Montreal bridal capsule opened to a full house at a boutique hotel in Griffintown. The press coverage credited Bridget Okafor, designer, not the Holloway brand, not a partnership. Her name clean and specific over work she had made. She stood in the showroom and watched women move through the room in things she had imagined and then built from nothing, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a person who had returned to exactly the life they were supposed to be living. The settlement had closed 4 months prior. Rowan had taken 28% of the brand's assessed value and signed away all intellectual property claims. His new firm with Delphine had launched and received polite industry attention and no major commissions in its first quarter. She'd heard, through someone who moved in the same circles, that the partnership was already showing signs of the same friction she recognized from her own first years with Rowan. The slow match between someone who needed credit and someone who made the thing worth crediting. She did not think about it often. She had too much work to do. A museum in Quebec City had commissioned a capsule to accompany a textile history exhibition. An impossibly specific brief, modern silhouettes that referenced the material culture of 18th century New France without pastiche. Work that acknowledged the past without reconstructing it. A bridge between what was made and what could be. Bridget sat at her drafting table with the brief spread in front of her and picked up her pencil. She drew the first line of the first sketch. It was, as always, entirely hers.